Her cousin reached the cabin after the fire had cooled. A Lakota chief had carried her out. The smoke was already gone when I got there. Not the smell that stayed for days, that charred pine and wet hash smell that gets into the back of your throat and sits there like something that won't be moved. But the smoke itself, the column of it I'd seen from the ridge 2 hours before, that was done. Just the black skeleton of the cabin and the red clay around it scorched pale, and a crow on one of the standing corner posts doing nothing at all, the way crows do when they've decided a place is finished. I came down from the north. The way the land fell there, you hit a dry creek bed and then a shelf of limestone, and then you're looking down at the hollow where the Hendersons had built 15 years prior. Nora Henderson by then, just Nora, her husband Caleb 3 years buried out behind the cabin in ground. She'd broken herself because the ground was frozen and nobody came fast enough. She ran the place alone. 2 horses, a kitchen garden, 40 head of cattle that had drifted down to maybe 30 by that point. Everyone in the valley knew it. Everyone said it wasn't right. A woman alone out here, the country being what it was, drought that last summer, Comanche trouble 2 valleys over, water rights disputes that had turned ugly twice in the past year. But nobody did much more than say it. Saying was free and help cost something. I got down to the creek bed and I stopped my horse and I looked at what was left and I thought, if she was in that, there's nothing to find that would be her. But there were tracks, 2 sets coming south out of the hollow. One was boots, a man's, wide and flat-soled, a man of some weight. The other was moccasin. I'd been reading tracks since I was old enough to know what I was looking at, and those moccasin tracks were carrying something. The stride was shorter than it should have been for that length of foot, the left side pressing harder into the clay, the weight thrown distinctly forward. A man carrying a load in his arms and moving as fast as that weight allowed. I followed south along the creek. They said afterward that Broken Lance had been in the valley 2 days before the fire, trading post, probably, or scouting water. It had been a dry summer, and the water tables were interesting to anyone paying attention. I never knew his exact business and I didn't ask. What I know is what I saw when I came around the bend in that creek and found them. He'd made a camp in the willows. Small fire, screened from every direction by the thicket, the smoke broken by the canopy so it wouldn't read at any distance. He was kneeling beside it when I rode up, and he looked at me without surprise, which is how he always looked at everything, like the world was moving slow enough for him to already know what it was going to do before it did it. He had that quality. I've known only 3 or 4 men in my life with that quality, and every one of them had seen enough hard things that the ordinary things had lost their power to startle. Nora was lying on a blanket behind him, her face turned away, her hair loose and dark with soot. She was breathing, I could see that from where I sat the horse, the rise and fall of her under the blanket clear enough. He'd wrapped her in a second blanket, a good thick one of his own, and he'd put a folded piece of doeskin under her head where the ground was hard and cold from the creek. He said something in Lakota that I didn't catch, something short, the kind of thing you say as an identification, not a greeting. Then he said in English, "Her hands." I got down and tied off the horse and went to where she lay. Her hands were wrapped in strips of cloth, his shirt, I thought, torn into long sections, and there was blood soaked through on the right one, dark and dried to the wrapping. She'd been trying to get out. Whether she made it to the door herself before he reached her or whether he pulled her through the last of it, I didn't know then, and I only learned pieces of it later from her own account, and even she wasn't clear on all of it, the way your memory goes hazy when the body has been through something that big. She had a burn on her left forearm, the skin raised in a pale blister from the wrist to the inside of the elbow. Her face was not touched. Her face was completely clean. He'd washed her face. I looked at him. He was stripped to the waist in the cold air of that creek bottom, sitting easy on his heels, and I understood then why his shirt was the bandage on her hands. Not just the bandage. A good linen shirt, something he'd been wearing, not a spare piece of rag. He'd torn it for her. "How far did you carry her?" I said. He looked at me a moment, Far enough, he said. Through the burning. Through part of it, he looked at the fire. The east wall was gone. I went in from the east. I nodded. We sat with that a moment. You knew she was in there, I said. I saw the smoke from the ridge. By the time I got down, there wasn't time to go looking for someone else to do it. That was all he said about it. That was the entire account. My name is James Whitehorse Coulter. My mother was Oglala. My father a trapper from Missouri, who stayed long enough to marry her and short enough that she didn't grieve him much when he was gone. I grew up in two worlds and was comfortable in neither, and eventually I stopped trying to be comfortable in either one and just became what I was, a man who could move between them, who knew both languages and both sets of manners and both ways of reading the land, which turned out to be useful enough that people on both sides found reasons to want me around. I'd been chief of the Yellowstone Band for 11 years. Chief is a white word and it fits imprecisely. What I was, more exactly, was the man the band trusted to think and speak for them in council and to carry the weight of decisions. The water decisions, the land decisions, the decisions about when to hold ground and when to move it quietly, the decisions that kept 60-some people fed and sheltered through seasons that didn't always cooperate. To the settlers, I was the Indian chief who kept things quiet up north, who you could deal with if you needed to deal with someone, who wouldn't make trouble if you didn't make trouble. To my own people, I was something more and also something less than that framing allowed for, the way you always are with people who actually know you. I had no wife. My wife, Sunflower, had died of the fever 6 years before, and I had not looked for another. Not out of grief. The grief had moved into a different shape over the years, something that was part of me but didn't stop me, but because I had not found anyone who made the looking seem worth it. I had a daughter, Ruby, who was 9 years old and lived with my sister's family near the agency, safe and fed, and being educated in 2 languages the way I wanted for her. I had a horse named Drum who had the steadiest nerves of any animal I'd ever owned. I had a rifle that had belonged to my grandfather, and a piece of land above the creek that I'd been slowly building on for 4 years, adding a room when I had time, improving the well, planting things that would take years to be worth anything, but that I intended to be around long enough to see worth something. I say all this because Nora asked me later, much later, months into things on one of those evenings on the bench, what kind of man I was before that day at the Hollow. She asked it straight, the way she asked everything, like the answer mattered and she wanted the actual answer and not the shaped version. And those are the things I told her. The work, the band, Ruby, the land, my grandfather's rifle. She listened the way she listened to everything, still and careful, and then she said, "You left the part out where you're respected." I said I didn't think that was mine to say. She said, "That's the part you always leave out." Broken Lance wouldn't leave until she woke up. I could see he wasn't going to, and I didn't waste breath saying otherwise. We made the camp more comfortable, more wood on the fire, a windbreak of cut branches on the north side, and we waited. He sat the way he always sat, easy and still, the way a man sits when his body isn't in the habit of fidgeting because it learned early that fidgeting was a problem. I sat the other way, cross-legged on the other side of the fire, and we didn't talk much. We didn't need to. I'd known Broken Lance since we were both younger men, and we'd long since gotten past the need to fill silence. She woke up in the early evening, when the light was going orange through the willow canopy above us. She didn't cry out, which surprised me. She opened her eyes and looked at the branches above her for a moment, just looking, taking stock, and then she turned her head and looked at Broken Lance, who was close, watching her. She said in a voice like gravel and ash, "You're the one who came in after me." He said yes. She said, "I couldn't find the door. I knew where it was and I couldn't find it." He said, "It was behind you. The smoke gets your sense of direction." She was quiet for a moment, processing that. Then she said, "My hands." He said, "They'll heal. The right one took more, but they'll heal." She looked at her hands, wrapped in the cloth of what had been his shirt, and then she looked at his bare chest and his arms and she said, "You're cold." He said, "No." She said, "You're lying." It wasn't said harshly. It was said the way you say a true thing to someone you've already decided to trust, which was an extraordinary thing to decide about a man you've been conscious of for about 45 seconds. She reached out and pulled the edge of the top blanket toward him. Just the edge, just enough for a man to accept without making it into something. And he accepted it, shifted slightly, let the edge of it come across his shoulders, and that was the whole exchange. That small calibrated thing. I've thought about it 100 times since, the precision of her. She couldn't travel for 3 days. Her hands were the main obstacle, the right one especially, a deep burn across the palm where she'd grabbed something to feel her way, a door handle or a support beam. She wasn't certain, and neither was I. Broken Lance changed the wrappings morning and evening, and he used something from a flat pouch on his belt, a paste that smelled of pine resin and something else, something green and sharp. I asked him once what was in it. He said, "What my mother used." I didn't ask further. She was awake for long stretches of the second day. She lay still and she looked at the willows and she thought, visibly. You could see the thinking move through her face, some internal accounting of the situation, what was lost, what wasn't, what came next. I found that composure extraordinary, though I didn't say so. Most people, when what they've built their life around burns to the ground, there's a time when the composure fails. She had that time. It came in the evening of the second day, quietly, when she was looking at nothing in particular and her face did something controlled but not quite controlled enough, and then she closed her eyes and breathed through it, and when she opened them again the composure was back. Settled back like she'd picked it back up. She didn't make a sound through any of it. On the second day I rode into Milford for supplies, proper bandages, some food, a shirt for Broken Lance. It was a 40-minute ride each way, and when I came back Nora was sitting up, her back against a willow trunk, and she and Broken Lance were talking. Not about her situation or the fire or what came next. She was asking him about the willows, whether there were willows like these further north. He was telling her about a river he knew, up near the Montana line, a river with willows so thick on both banks that you could walk along the water and never see it, just hear it. She was listening with her whole face. That's the only way I know to say it. Her whole face was engaged, turned toward him, interested in the way some people are interested in things only when those things are useful to them, and interested in a deeper way, the kind that just wants to know. I gave Broken Lance the shirt. He looked at it a moment, rough linen, good but plain, and then he put it on and buttoned it with the deliberate attention of a man who was cold and didn't intend to admit it. Nora watched him button it, and then she looked at me. She said, "Thank you, James." That was the first time she called me by name. I'd met her before Trading Day 2 years back at the post near the river, but I'd been someone adjacent to her life then, the Indian chief Della had mentioned, a name attached to a distant context. She hadn't looked at me directly. Now she was looking at me directly, the full weight of her attention, and she was saying my name like she meant it and not just the syllables of it. I said it was nothing. It was not nothing, but I said it. On the third day, Broken Lance left. He didn't say goodbye in the way I'd call saying goodbye. He said something in Lakota to Nora, slow and clear enough that she might catch a word or two if she was listening right. She said, "What does that mean?" He said that the scar on your arm will make you remember, and the rest will fade. She looked at him a moment. She said, "I'll remember all of it." He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary, something moving behind his face that I recognized as something he was deciding not to say. Then he mounted and rode north and was gone into the tree line. Nora watched the willows for a long time after. Then she said, "Who is he?" I said, "A man I've known 20 years. You won't find better." She said, "No," and then again quieter to herself, "No. I don't think you would." I couldn't leave her. That is the plain truth of it, the shortest version. I had things that needed attending. Band matters never pause. There was a water rights dispute at the northern grazing land, a meeting with the territorial agent that I'd already put off twice, and Ruby needing a visit before the weather turned. But I couldn't put Nora on a horse and send her to Milford alone with her hands wrapped and her cabin a pile of cold ash and nowhere to go except Della's, and she made clear on the third morning that she wasn't going to Della's. She said, "I'll go back to the hollow." I said, "There's nothing standing there worth going back to." She said, "The land's there, the root cellar's there, the well." I said, "You can't rebuild alone. Not with your hands the way they are." She looked at me. Those gray-green eyes of hers had something in them that was neither hard nor soft but was something you simply couldn't push against, not because it pushed back, but because it was perfectly dense, like trying to push against water that wasn't moving. She said, "I didn't say I'd rebuild alone. I said I'd go back." I sat with that a moment. Then I said, "All right." So we went back. The hollow looked different with her standing in it. I'd seen it the first morning from the limestone shelf above, and all I'd seen was ruin, the scorched posts, the collapsed roof, the smell of ash and burned wood that was going to stay in that ground for years. But Nora walked through it careful, touching things with the backs of her wrapped hands since her palms were still too tender, and what she was doing was not grieving. She was cataloging. This could be used, this was lost, this needed to be considered. The root cellar door had sealed with the heat, and the goods inside were entirely fine sacks of grain, dried beans, a winter's worth of canned goods in glass jars, not one of which had broken. The well was fine. The barn, 30 yards back from the main structure, hadn't caught, the fire had stayed with the cabin, and the wind had been merciful in its direction. The horses were gone, spooked and scattered, but the barn itself was sound. The kitchen garden was singed on the near side, but the far beds were untouched, still green. She stood in the middle of what had been the cabin floor, her boots on the charred planks, and she looked at the 4 standing corner posts and the collapsed center, and she said, "The bones are good." I said, "You'd need new lumber, substantial amounts." She said, "I know where to get lumber." I said, "Your hands won't be right for 6 weeks, you know that." She turned and looked at me, not with the words into the air look, not with anything that could be called asking. She was just looking at me and letting me decide openly, without pressure, what I intended to be. The decision was mine. She was clear about that. I rode north to the band camp that evening, and I told my cousin, afraid of nothing, what was happening. He said, "How long?" I said I didn't know exactly. He looked at me. Afraid of nothing has a particular look for when he's understood more than you've said, and is choosing not to say it back, and he said, "Send word when you need the council." I said I would. I came back in the morning with 2 pack horses loaded with lumber I'd arranged for at the mill in Callaway, and a set of tools, and the clear intention in my head of what order things needed to be done. I want to speak about that time carefully, because it matters. Building is straightforward when you understand it. You work from the ground up, from the structural to the finish, and you keep the problems in the right order. I know what I'm doing with a frame, and I know what I'm doing with a roof, and I work clean and steady, and I don't hurry where hurrying will cost you later. But building at the Henderson Hollow was different from any building I'd done, and the difference was Nora. She couldn't use her hands for the first 2 weeks. The right one especially, the deep burn, needed complete rest to heal right, and she knew it, and she accepted it not easily, because she was not a woman who accepted uselessness easily, but rationally, the way a smart person accepts a hard fact. So she used everything else. She directed. She observed. She said from 6 feet away, "The left post is a finger off plumb," and she was right. I checked it. She planned the day's work while I ate breakfast, having thought about it in the dark before I was awake. She figured the lumber needs for the next week's work in her head while we were finishing the current week's. And she cooked. I don't know how she did it with wrapped hands, with her wrists, with her forearms, with a cleverness about leveraging tools against fixed surfaces, but the meals were not reduced. She made food that a man working hard wanted to come to at the end of the day. She did it without commentary or complaint, which is a particular kind of strength, the kind that doesn't ask to be noticed. In the evening she sat on an upturned bucket and read aloud from the King James Bible she'd pulled out of the root cellar. It was the only book she had. Everything else had burned, while I worked the last hour of light. The language of it filled the hollow, the long rhythms of it, and I don't know if she read it for my benefit or her own, or simply because the sound of words filled the silence in a way that silence couldn't. But it became part of the work, the sound of her reading, and the work would not have been the same without it. There were evenings I stopped working earlier than I needed to because I wanted to listen. I wouldn't say that to her, and I didn't need to. She'd look up from the page when she heard the draw knife stop, and she'd keep reading, and I'd sit on the ground with my back against the new wall, and I'd listen, and it was enough. Sometimes she picked the passages because she knew what she was doing, and sometimes she picked them at random, or what looked like random. Either way, the Book of Ruth twice and the Psalms more than I could count, and Job, which she read straight through one evening without stopping, all the way to the end. And when she finished, she closed the cover and sat with the book in her lap for a minute without saying anything, and then she said, "He got it all back." That always struck me as the suspicious part. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because the real things you lose you don't get back. You get different things. Sometimes they're better, but they're not the same things." She opened the Bible again. "It's the only part of that story I don't believe." Then she went back to reading, and I went back to work. In the third week she started using her right hand again, lightly, wrapping it herself each morning with clean cloth. I watched her do it one morning without having meant to. She was sitting on the tailgate of the borrowed wagon, her back to me, working the cloth around her scarred palm with the total focus of a person doing something painful and intending to do it right and not make a fuss about the pain. She worked with quiet efficiency. She made no sound. I went back to what I was doing. By the fourth week she was carrying things, lighter loads at first, then progressively more. I told her once to set down a bundle of lath and let me get it when I was free. She said, "I've been carrying loads since I was 11 years old, James Coulter, and I don't intend to stop because of a scar." I said I understood that, but the hand. She said, "My hand knows what it can take." And she was right, and I didn't say anything else about it. There was a man from Milford who came by twice during that month. Aldous Fitch, a rancher with land east of town, a man who wore his money in the way some men wear money, visible, a little ahead of him when he walked into a room. He had apparently decided some time before the fire that Nora Henderson was a problem he had a solution to, and my presence in the hollow was an obstacle he hadn't calculated. He came the first time with his hat in his hand, and a covered dish his cook had made, something with cream in it, and he looked at me with the look men use when they mean to diminish you with a look, and have found it works on most people. He said, in the way of a man addressing one person but meaning his words for another, "Good that you've got yourself some help, Nora. Hard to know when help will leave, though." Nora took the covered dish from him. She said, "The help stays as long as it's needed, Aldous. That's how help works." She handed me the dish, which I held, and she walked back to the cabin wall we'd been raising, which I had set down to meet him, and after a moment I set the dish on the wagon tailgate and went back to the wall. He came a second time, and she met him at what was becoming the door frame. The lintel was up, the door wasn't, and they spoke for a few minutes I couldn't hear from where I was working. When he left, he didn't look at me. He just turned his horse and walked it out of the hollow and didn't come back. I never asked her what she said to him. She didn't tell me. I didn't need to know. Whatever it was hers to say. I have to speak plainly about what was happening in me during those weeks, because otherwise the rest doesn't make sense. I have been honest with myself since I was a young man about what I feel and why I feel it. It's a discipline, that kind of honesty, and it cost me something to develop, but I'm not sorry I developed it. So I knew what I was feeling in the hollow. I named it early, and I set it aside, and I did the work. She was a particular kind of person, and I had not met her kind before, or not exactly her kind. the particular combination of things that she was. She did not diminish over time. That's the thing I noticed first and most. Some people, when you're around them for long enough, you start to find the places where they're smaller than they looked from a distance, the insecurities, the avoidances, the private bargains they've struck with themselves. Nora was not that. The longer I was around her, the more I saw, and what I saw was more, not less. The way she grieved Caleb, she had loved him and she'd lost him, and it was a real loss, not performed. But she hadn't let it make her a monument to grief. She'd let it make her more capable of knowing what mattered. The way she thought, going interior and quiet when something was hard, not talking through it, going somewhere inside herself and working it through and coming out the other side with a direction. The way she talked to the horses when they came back one by one, drifting back to the hollow as horses do when they remember where the grain is, as if she'd never doubted they would. The way she never, in 43 days, asked me why I'd stayed. I think she already knew. One evening at the end of the 5th week, the roof on and the windows the only thing left, she made coffee on the outdoor fire we'd been using all along, and she brought me a cup and sat beside me on the limestone ledge that ran along the south wall of the hollow. The ledge was just there, a natural thing, 10 yards of flat pale rock that caught the last of the afternoon sun. We sat and drank the coffee, and the light went down across the valley, the slow western way, and the first stars appeared. She said, "My father didn't have much use for Lakota people." I said, "Most don't." She said, "I know, I'm not defending it. I'm just telling you where I started from so you know how far I've come." She looked at her right hand, the scar visible now, the burn healed into a pale, ropey ridge across the heel of the palm. She ran her thumb along it. She said, "Broken lance carried me a long way." I said, "He did." She said, "And you've been here 40 days. I said, 43. She looked at me, not the look from that first day in the hollow, the question and the challenge combined. Something different, quieter, decided, like a door that has been carefully considered and carefully opened. She said, "I'd like you to still be here at 100. I held the coffee cup in both hands and I looked at the valley going into its evening dark, and I felt the weight of those words land in me the way a true thing lands, not with noise, not with ceremony, but with the particular gravity of something real. I didn't say anything for a moment. I let it be what it was. Then I said, "That suit me." She didn't say anything more. She reached over and put her hand on my forearm, the scarred one, palm down, the ridge of the scar against my sleeve, and she left it there. Flat and warm and deliberate, not clutching, just placed there, the way you place something you intend to keep. We watched the stars come in. The valley talked, of course it did. Milford was not a large place, and a large place can absorb a thing like this, a Lakota chief rebuilding a white widow's homestead, without the whole community needing to weigh in on it. Milford was not a large place. The opinions circulated fast, and I heard them third and fourth hand, which was the right distance. Afraid of Nothing told me what he heard at the trading post, which he delivered with his particular dry humor. He said my personal affairs had apparently achieved the status of community property, and people were managing them freely on my behalf. Nora told me what Della had said to her, which was the concerned relative version, which amounted to, "Be careful what you're doing, people will talk." Nora had said, apparently, that people talk about everything, and they might as well have something worth talking about. I liked that. I turned it over in my mind. There was one harder thing. A man named Sutter who ran a small claim north of the hollow and who had the kind of contempt that some men carry like a weapon, because it's the only weapon they have. He came by one afternoon when Nora was inside. I was in the yard cutting shingles, the draw knife going in long pulls across the cedar blanks. He rode up and stopped and delivered himself of his opinions, which were the standard type, and which I won't give the honor of repeating in full. They involved my blood and my people, and what he thought should happen to men who put themselves where they weren't wanted. He said all of it, and stood there waiting to see what I'd do. I set down the draw knife. I looked at him. He was a small man in the way that matters, regardless of his size. I said, "You're on her land." He blinked. "What?" I said, "You're standing on Nora Henderson's land without her invitation. You'll ride out now." He wanted to make something of it. I could see the wanting in him, the calculation. And then the calculation ran its course and he turned and rode out. Not clean, not fast, with muttering and a look back over his shoulder, but he went. Nora had heard from the window. She came out and stood beside me looking at the dust settling where he'd gone. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Nothing to thank me for." She said, "James." And then she was quiet, and the quiet held everything she didn't say and didn't need to say, and I received it, and that was how things were between us already by that point. The windows went in on a Tuesday. I remember it specifically because Tuesday was when the lumber delivery came from Callaway, and the glass had come with it, wrapped in burlap, 2 panes making the whole journey without breaking, which felt like something. When I set the second frame into the last opening and stepped back and looked at the cabin whole, the new timber pale and clean against the scorched earth, the roof sound, the windows square, I held still and looked at it for a while. I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time, and I'm not entirely sure I can name it. Not pride exactly, though it had pride in it. More like a kind of completed rightness. A thing that needed doing had been done. The world was better arranged than it had been 43 days ago. That's a feeling worth stopping for. Nora came out and stood beside me. She looked at the cabin for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, "Caleb built the first one himself." "Did I tell you that?" I said, "No." She said, "He was a good man. He wasn't much of a carpenter. The windows were never square. I used to be able to feel a draft from across the room in January, and we'd stuff the gaps with rags every winter." She paused. "Your windows are square." I said, "I can build a gap in the frame if you miss the draft." She laughed. She laughed so that it filled the hollow, nothing performed in it, nothing held back, a full sound, and I wanted to hold onto the sound of it the way you want to hold onto certain kinds of light. She said, "Don't you dare, James Coulter." There was a night in November, the second month of winter, when the temperature dropped fast and sudden the way it does in that country. You go to bed with the cold manageable, and you wake in the dark to a world changed. I woke at 3 in the morning because the horses were uneasy. I could hear them from my bunk, that restless shuffle and the particular sound of hooves on frozen ground, and I dressed in the dark and went out. The cold hit like something solid. The sky was absolutely clear, no cloud, every star burning, and the temperature was the kind that comes with a clear winter sky, deep and total. My breath made large clouds. The ground was iron. I got to the lean-to and I settled the horses. Hay, reassurance, a check of the water barrel which was icing at the edges and needed breaking. I did what needed doing, and then I stood in the lean-to doorway for a moment, looking at the cabin across the yard, and there was lamplight at the window. She was awake. She'd heard the horses too, or she'd felt the cold change, and she was awake. I went back across the yard, and she opened the door before I knocked. She had a lamp in one hand and her coat on over her nightclothes, and she said, "The horses." I said, "Settled. I broke the ice in the water barrel." She nodded. She looked past me at the yard, the frost on everything, the hard dark of the sky. She said, "It went down fast." I said, "It's going to be a long night." She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I have the stove going." I came in. The cabin was warm from the stove, the good dry heat of a fire that's been built right, and she had coffee on. She'd already started coffee, which told me how long she'd been awake. We sat at the table with the lamp between us and the stove throwing heat and the cold pressing at the walls, and we drank the coffee and we talked. Not about anything important in the way of being planned. About her father, who had been a man she'd admired and had not always agreed with. About my mother, who had been the same kind of woman. I told her, certain of her own mind, and not in the habit of explaining herself to people who weren't going to understand anyway. about the water rights fight, and what I thought the territorial government was going to do about the grazing agreements in the next 5 years, which I'd been thinking through and which she had opinions about, clear and useful ones. We talked until the light began, until the dark outside the window went gray, and then the gray went pale, and then the sun came over the eastern ridge, and the frost outside turned briefly gold, all that cold surface catching the first light and holding it. She refilled the coffee. She looked out the window at the gold frost. She said, "This is what I thought marriage was supposed to be like, before I had enough experience to know what it actually was like." I said, "What did you think it was like?" She said, "This, just this, talking through the cold night and the light coming in and another cup of coffee." I looked at her across the table and the lamp and the morning light, and I said, "That's what it is." She met my eyes. The whole of what we were to each other was in that moment, plain as the frost and the light. I went to visit Ruby in October. She was 10 by then, a fall birthday, and my sister's family threw a small gathering that Ruby tolerated with the restrained politeness of a child who has been given too many unnecessary presents and is too well raised to say so. I found a few minutes alone with her in the afternoon, down by the creek behind the house where she liked to go, and I told her about the summer. Not everything. I told her about the fire and the hollow and the building, that I'd been helping a neighbor, a woman who'd lost her home. Ruby said, "Is she nice?" I said, "She's good, that's more than nice." Ruby looked at the creek. She had my mother's way of thinking through her face, all of it visible if you knew what you were looking at. She said, "Is she going to come here sometime?" I said I thought she might. When things were more settled, when the season allowed, when Ruby wanted to meet her. If Ruby wanted to. Ruby said, "I think you already asked her." I said, "What makes you say that?" She said, "Because you're not a man who waits around wondering. You decide things and then you do them." She said it simply, the way you state a known fact. Then she looked up at me. "Am I right?" I said, "You're very smart, Ruby." She said, "I know." And she turned back to the creek with the complete focus of a 10-year-old who has decided a conversation is concluded. I want to say something about carrying, about what it means and what it costs. Broken Lance carried Nora out of that fire. He went in through the east wall where the wall had failed and the smoke was already total, and he found her in the dark by sound, or by something else I can't name, and he picked her up and carried her out through it. He carried her 2 miles south along the creek before he stopped. No shirt in the cold, moving as fast as the load allowed. He set her down in the willows and he made a fire screen from 3 directions, and he covered her and he washed her face and he used his shirt, his only shirt, the one on his back, to wrap her hands. That act, that one unasked for act by a man nobody had called on and who had no obligation, is the reason any of the rest happened. Without it there is no 43 days in the hollow, no windows going in square on a Tuesday morning, no laugh filling the yard like something you want to hold, no hand placed flat and warm and decided on my forearm in the evening. I have thought a great deal about what moved him to go in. I don't know. I know Broken Lance, and I know he is not a man who explains himself, and I know better than to press. But I have thought about it, and what I arrive at is this. He went in because she was there, and the fire was there, and there was something to be done. That's all. There was something to be done, and he was there, and so he did it. A man who has stripped away everything that isn't necessary from himself doesn't need a reason beyond that. I stayed in that hollow for 43 days and then many more after. The reason is the same. She was there. There was something to be done. I did it. What I didn't expect, what I want to say plainly if you're listening, is what gets given back. The first hard frost came in late October. I was back at my place above the creek by then, coming down to the hollow twice a week, checking that things were holding, bringing what was needed. She always had coffee on, and she always had something worth saying, and we always found an hour at least on the limestone bench. There was an ease between us that was different from the work ease, less directed, less purposeful, more like two people in the same current moving the same direction without having to discuss it. The morning of the first frost I came down before sunrise. I'd seen the sky the previous evening, the particular color and clarity that means the temperature is going to drop hard overnight, and I was thinking about our horses. Two were still not fully weathered in for the season, the Linta needing additional boarding on the north side. I came into the hollow yard, and the lamps were already lit inside, and I could smell wood smoke and something cooking on the stove, and the frost was white on every flat surface. She came out in her coat, her breath making small clouds, and she stopped when she saw me in the yard and she said, "I was about to ride up to you." I said, "The horses." She said, "The horses." We looked at each other in the gray pre-dawn cold, the lamp light from the window just reaching us, and she had a small smile for the two of us landing on the same thought at the same hour. Then we went to work. An hour to get the Linta right, the additional boards I'd cut in September, stacked and ready because I'd cut them in September thinking about this morning, and the extra hay laid deep and the horses settled in. We worked side by side and talked only the work talk, the efficient kind. Hand me that. Hold there. Watch the second nail. When it was done, we stood in the Linta doorway together and looked at the frost-white yard in the early light. She said, "I wasn't going to make it through winter alone. I want to say that clearly." I said, "You might have managed." She said, "James." And the way she said my name, clear and level, like placing a marker, I understood she wasn't interested in my courtesy. I said, "No, you weren't." She said, "And now I will." I said, "Yes." She turned and looked at me, and she was close enough that I could see the small particular things, the scar on her left forearm, the winter-cracked skin at the corner of her lips, the color that cold air brings to a woman's face. She reached up and put her hand on my chest, flat, the scarred palm against my coat, and she looked at me. Not questioning, already on the other side of the question. She said, "You're the steadiest man I've ever known." I looked at her hand on my chest, and I put my hand over it, both our hands, hers against my coat, mine on top of hers, and I could feel the ridge of her scar through the cloth. I said, "I intend to stay steady." She said, "Good," and then quieter, "Good." The frost was in the grass all around us, and the horses were warm behind us, and the sky in the east was just beginning to color, and there was nothing in the world at that moment that needed adding to. The valley settled into it. Not all at once, not cleanly, and not everyone. There are people who have a picture of the world and who resent anything that doesn't fit it, and they will carry that resentment to the grave and be buried with it, and that's their business. I didn't ask for acceptance, and I didn't campaign for it. I just did what I did and was what I was. Sutter moved his claim south in the spring for reasons he didn't advertise. Aldous Fitch married a woman from Cheyenne by February and seemed genuinely relieved to have his attentions redirected somewhere they were wanted. Della came by at Christmas with 2 pies and an apology she carried in the set of her shoulders. She never quite said it, but Nora didn't require her to. Just opened the door and took a pie and said, "Come in out of the cold." The territorial agent, a man named Harwick who was more reasonable than the position typically produced, shook my hand at a land meeting in March without any visible reluctance, which was more than I'd gotten from him previously. The Yellowstone band's elders held the situation the way elders hold things they're not certain of, carefully, not committing. A few of the younger men thought it was funny, which I chose to take as a form of affection. Afraid of Nothing never said a word about it to me directly, which was his way of saying he approved. There was a moment I want to tell you about, in February of that first winter together. There had been a disagreement at the North Water meeting, 2 settler ranchers, and a man from the Territorial Land Office and me, over the creek diversion rights that had been contested for 3 years. It was the kind of meeting that is not really a meeting but a slow negotiation where everyone is looking for the edge they can press without being seen to press it. I had the documentation, and I had the history, and I had the arguments, and by the end I had what the band needed from it, which was confirmation of the diversion rights for the North Pasture through another 5-year term. The land office man signed it. We shook hands. The two ranchers shook my hand too, not warmly, but they shook it. When I came to the hollow that evening and told Nora what had happened, she said, "That's 3 years you've been working that." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do the elders know how long you've been working it?" I said they knew. She said, "Do they know what it cost you to keep working it, the meetings you sat through, the way those men look at you in a room?" I said they probably knew the shape of it. She said, "You should tell them the specific of it. Men need to hear the specific." I said I'd think about it. I did think about it. And in April at the Spring Council, I told the council the specific of the water rights fight, the whole 3 years of it, the particular meetings and the particular indignities and the particular outcome. I am not in the habit of presenting my own difficulty to the council. The council has enough difficulty of its own to attend to, but I did it. And when I was done, one of the oldest men, my mother's uncle, a man named Gathers the Wind, who was 80-some years and who had been at council longer than I'd been alive, said, "We see what you carry." He said it in Lakota. He said it the way you say a thing you mean completely. And then the council moved on to the next matter. I told Nora about it later. She listened with her hands around her coffee cup, that still quality of attention she had, and when I was done she said, "Good." Just that word. The way she said it, the word was full. It held everything she felt about it, about the council seeing me, about the old man saying what he said. Good, I understood it completely. There are women who tell you things you know about yourself, and thereby help you understand that you know them. She was that kind of woman. Ruby came in April. She was quiet when she first saw the hollow, a child's quiet, the measuring kind. She walked through the cabin without being told to, touching the door frame, looking at the ceiling, the way a child takes in a new space and decides what it is. She stopped at the window. She looked at it. She said, "The windows are square." Nora said, "Your father made them." Ruby looked at me. Then she looked at Nora. The look went between us and took in something that I imagine was visible to anyone who knew how to look. She said, "He told me you were good. That it was more than nice." Nora looked at me with something in her face that was not quite a smile, or was a smile at its foundation with something larger sitting on top of it. She said, "Is that what he said?" Ruby said, "Yes, but I think he meant something that doesn't have a good word for it." Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she crouched down, went to eye level, and she looked at Ruby carefully, and Ruby looked back at her with the same serious attention. Nora said, "You're going to be the smartest person in any room you're ever in." Ruby said, "I know, and then can I see the horses?" We took her to the horses. I will tell you what the hollow looks like in the spring now. The grass comes back fast in that low country. By April, the scorched ring that used to mark where the old cabin stood is almost invisible, just a faint difference in the green, a shade darker, like the soil remembers something the grass doesn't. The root cellar has new steel hinges that won't rust. The barn has a weather vane Nora found at the trading post in Milford, a running horse in iron that turns easy in even a light wind off the ridge. The kitchen garden is twice the size it was. There is a bench on the south side of the hollow on the limestone ledge. I built it in the 3rd week. A plank between 2 uprights, practical then, still practical now. And in the evenings we sit on it, sometimes the 3 of us when Ruby is staying through a week, sometimes just the 2 of us when she's back at my sister's. The light goes out of that valley, the way light goes out of western country, slow and total. And the first stars come the same way they always have. She sits close enough that I feel the warmth of her arm against mine. Both her hands are scarred now, the right more than the left. She doesn't conceal them or mention them or make them into anything. She uses them completely, the way she uses everything she has. Sometimes when we're on that bench she puts the scarred hand on my arm, palm down, The way she first did it that October morning in the lean-to doorway, and I put my hand over hers, and we sit like that and watch the evening. The valley knows what I am now. Not because I announced it, not because there was a ceremony or a moment where a thing was declared. Just because a man who does what needs doing, who stays when there is staying to do, who builds a thing right and stands his ground when he needs to and provides what's needed, a man like that, people eventually know what he is. They know it without being told. They know it and they let him know they know it, with a nod at the trading post or a word at the meeting, nothing large, nothing formal. It's enough. It's more than enough. Broken Lance came through the following summer. He stayed one night, ate with us, drank coffee on the bench. He played a hand-slap game with Ruby that I'd never seen before, some variation he'd invented or inherited, and Ruby learned the rhythm of it and then beat him 3 times running, and he lost gracefully, which he did not have to do. He looked at the hollow the way he looks at things, unhurried, taking stock. Before he left in the morning, he spoke to me in Lakota. He said, "A man's life is the things he chose to do when no one required him to." I said, "You went in first, you started it." He said, "I carried her to the creek, you did the rest." He mounted and rode north, and I watched him go until the tree line took him. Nora came and stood beside me, her shoulder against mine, and we both looked at the trees after there was nothing to see in them anymore. She put her hand into the crook of my arm. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying. The morning was coming full into the hollow, the light in the new grass, the weather-vane horse turning slow in the wind off the north ridge, the horses in the barn moving with the comfortable sounds of animals that are where they belong. One good piece of land, one good woman, her hand in the crook of my arm. The work still ahead and the strength to do it. That's what I have. That's enough.